Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining. This is our first webinar on Diagrid Catalyst, which are a set of unified APIs for messaging, data, and workflow. And we have a jam-packed agenda for you today. We're going to start off with talking about some of the distributed application challenges that are kind of inherent with building distributed applications, especially when you add in, cross-platform and polyglot capabilities. Then we're going to get into what we're offering with the Diagrid Catalyst APIs. We're going to do two demos. Kendall's going to show you what this kind of looks like running locally. We really worked hard on the local development experience for Catalyst. So we're excited to show that off. And then I'm going to show a cloud Catalyst demo showing how, you can use Catalyst APIs to interoperate across clouds and platforms. And then lastly, we have some resources to kind of leave you with. Going to start off with quick introductions. My name's Alice Gibbons. I do customer success here at Diagrid. I've been, at Diagrid for over a year now and was at Microsoft working on, many similar things before. And then I'm here with Kendall Roden. Kendall, did you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. Hi, all. Nice to meet you. My name is Kendall Roden. I am one of the product managers at Diagrid and also was previously at Microsoft working on the Azure Container Apps platform.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, and so I really wanted to start by talking about, the difficulties in building distributed apps. And this has really become a fragmented process across, many different avenues and many different pillars. Specifically, the sheer amount of frameworks and libraries that developers are using to build cloud-native distributed apps. If you just take a look at, for instance, the CNCF landscape and some of the application libraries that exist within that, it's truly wild. This has kind of led to, convoluted and repeated boilerplate code that kind of gets repeated very frequently across, platforms and languages. Additionally, developers have to spend increasing amounts of time, learning as well as keeping up to date with these new technologies and managing complex developer tool chains, right? This has also led to, rigid infrastructure lock-in, specifically around when you're using specific infrastructure code that binds developers to a single hosting platform as well as a single language and provides, maybe only a limited functionality within that specific language or within that specific platform that causes developers to have to reinvent or, reapply software patterns when switching platforms or languages. And last but not least, an increased amount of security vulnerabilities. So here, just specifically the more tools you're using within your software tool chain just gives you a greater surface area for potentially attack and more code as well, and leads to a greater attack surface area, which all of this kind of results into a slower amount of releases and, unreliable and potentially insecure applications really at its core. So, that's something that we are really passionate about here at Diagrid, and that's really something that we wanted to solve. So let's take a sample distributed application in this specific case. Let's take a look at what this might look like. Maybe I have, a number of different services. Here I have 4 different services here. And there are, many different patterns and practices that you might want to implement in distributed apps. And this is by no means a full list of all of them, but I want to cover a few. For instance, maybe you want to have a stateful workflow that your application runs. Maybe you want to invoke services, whether that be through asynchronous or synchronous communication, things like publish and subscribe or request reply patterns. And also, you typically want to access state, whether that be, external connectors to external systems or state that would be local to your system. And so, also on top of all those things, though, you want to ensure that you have resiliency in all of these calls, right? If it's a distributed application, they might be running on different systems, different platforms. You want to ensure that all of these calls, all these communications happen resiliently. You also want to have end-to-end observability baked into this entire process. And a lot of this and leads to reinventing common patterns, as I previously mentioned, in terms of, the number of SDKs, libraries, and dependencies that you have to use to give you all of these features. Additionally, we are accessing the typical distributed application is accessing, a ton of different services, cloud services typically today, things like AWS S3, Redis, and, maybe they're written in different languages. And this leads to, service and or infrastructure dependent or specific code, and then language specific implementation. So SDKs, for the AWS S3 bucket, or, for Cassandra that you need to reach out to from your other services. All of that would be baked in and included within your applications, leading to, kind of that code sprawl that you're going to get across your distributed system. And then, as I mentioned, we want to keep our applications secure, even though they are distributed and maybe running cross-platform. And more code definitely just means more attack surface. So how do you, add end-to-end security and governance across with things like RBAC and access control or MTLS across your applications? And while keeping this cross-platform modularity and capabilities. And this, already you can see all of these things on here. This has just gotten more and more complex. This has just really, instilled the amount of developer complexity that, developers have to deal with when just building distributed apps on a daily basis. And yeah, this is something that we really wanted to solve here at Diagrid. And so that's kind of why we developed Catalyst, which we think really offers a new level of portability and reliability at the application layer. And so what Catalyst is giving you is a single consistent API surface that you can access really across any platform and any application or any language application. So, you can see some of the APIs that we're providing in here for a lot of the consistent API or the distributed system patterns that I talked about before. So, workflows, publish and subscribe, service invocation for a request reply pattern. And then baked kind of across all of these APIs, we have observability and security and resiliency baked in really at its core. And this is something we're going to kind of dig into in this webinar and kind of show you what this means. And so I'm going to actually pass it over now to Kendall to talk a little bit about what we have built for Diagrid Catalyst and how it works.
What is Diagrid Catalyst? How does this actually look, in practice when we talk about the architecture? We talk a lot about this flexibility pattern of being able to really remove some of these dependencies from your application code. And I think Alice did a really great job of explaining kind of the wide array of things we're trying to combat with the Catalyst platform. But ultimately, it really starts with three major areas. One is your applications running the way that you want them to on any cloud provider. So ultimately, just think of this as being an unlock from a particular hosting platform. Typically when we adopt a hosting platform, right, when we go to Azure Functions, or maybe we are working on AWS Lambda, or maybe even going and migrating to Kubernetes, right? A lot of these sort of dictate that you run multiple of them, and figuring out how to interact across those services is quite challenging. So think of really being able to run an application on the platform where you're getting the benefits that your application needs, right? And not just making a concerted decision to migrate to a particular platform, but instead being able to integrate all of these platforms and really host your applications where it makes the most sense. So completely framework language agnostic. You can call these APIs over HTTP and gRPC from your application code running anywhere. And then we basically provide this unified set of APIs that Alice has alluded to and that we've seen on some of these previous slides. So today we provide support for 5 different API patterns: request reply, publish subscribe, workflow, key value, which is kind of state management, and then bindings, which allow you to essentially trigger applications or output to certain services based on events that are occurring either on the inbound side, like you want to listen to a particular queue, or maybe you want to output something to a queue after as a result of a different operation within your application. And then on top of these Catalyst APIs that we host and manage, you get some of those cross-cutting concerns around resiliency, observability, and security. So we'll show you our feature set today, but we had a great question in the chat. What does this look like message level security? What is the long-term vision around authentication and things like that? And we definitely have really ambitious plans. So happy to answer any other questions about the feature set that we have planned that may not just be there today. And then ultimately, once you call out to these APIs that we're hosting, we're back to your responsibility, which is the infrastructure services that you want to connect to, right? So message broker flexibility, database flexibility, services, really think of these as being other cloud services that you might want to interact with in order to trigger your application, or like I said, kind of connect to via this concept of output bindings. And what's really nice is, once again, you can bring in any combination of infrastructure to use with these APIs. So for example, I want to use the publish subscribe API. Which infrastructure do I want to use as the backing broker? I can make a quick switch, and really have flexibility around that without any application code or infrastructure plumbing. And then on top of that, one of the other things that we provide at Diagrid within Catalyst is a series of our own managed infrastructure services. So this is really for customers who are continuing to move up the abstraction stack, as you're developing and you don't necessarily want the infrastructure operations burden. You can essentially leverage out of the box services that we provide for pub sub and for state management. So if we're just going to do a quick dive into each of these APIs just to kind of understand within the context of Catalyst, what does this actually look like when implemented, or how does the flow of traffic work? So one thing to call out here is that, we provide these developer-centric APIs that allow you to build reliable and secure applications. And ultimately, the underpinning of all of this that makes Catalyst possible is an open source project called the Distributed Application Runtime, or Dapper. So if you're familiar with Dapper, there will definitely be some nice overlap in terms of the feature set and also what we're providing. But ultimately, we wanted Catalyst to be built on open source standards, leveraging, a set of tried and true APIs that have already proven successful for, 500,000 organizations today. I think we have around 3,000 end users of Dapper. And so what's really nice is being able to take that open source project and expand it and extend it and make it accessible for more audiences. So the workflow API is a great example of this. This is one of the newer APIs we've introduced into Catalyst, and also one of the newer APIs that's been introduced into the Dapper open source project. But essentially, the workflow API can be combined with other building blocks to define long-running persistent processes or data flows that essentially span a series of microservices, right? So I want to orchestrate a series of activities that execute in a particular sequence. And once again, not having to create that orchestration logic yourself, and having resiliency, error handling, state management all built in. And so it's as simple as, running your application workload. Once again, this can be any language, any framework running on any cloud provider, and you're going to create an application ID within Catalyst. So really the concept of an app ID in Catalyst is a representation of your external workflow or application that you can interact with in order to create some of the boundaries through which policy, access control, security via like API tokens and application tokens can be applied. So for every microservice you have running externally, or every modular monolith, or whatever that application architecture is you're using, you'll have a comparable app ID for each one of those services. And then you get a consistent API that you can essentially use in order to implement this workflow pattern. And we're going to be doing these webinars very frequently. We'll be having community calls. So we'll definitely be diving more into different kinds of samples, different ways and use cases that that you can target with Catalyst. But we can see this really consistent URL here. You're going to have your Catalyst project, the V1 workflows API, and then you basically pass in a workflow name and can kick it off. And then there's a series of other great APIs you can use to do things like polling, restarting a workflow, continuing as new, so on and so forth. Another one of the APIs we provide is the request reply API. So once again, you see that standard API URL. We have the V1 invoke endpoint. And in this case, we're going to have, an application, the caller, once again, running on any platform. It's going to have its application ID or its, app twin, I would say, inside of Catalyst. The application caller will use an API token to talk to the caller app ID, which will then forward that invocation request to a second app ID, which then facilitates the delivery of that request to your target application running on any platform. So what's nice is you get complete language agnosticism between these two applications. You don't have to worry about the security of the invocation calls. And then you get great things like access control lists on top of that to allow you to dictate if the caller has permissions to talk to the target. And once again, everything in gray there is being completely hosted and managed by Diagrid. The third API I want to highlight is the publish subscribe API, one that we definitely see being very valuable to users as implementing this kind of pattern is quite common. So we have a producer application. It has its respective app ID, and then we see a new concept being introduced, which is called a connection. And essentially what this connection is a named resource that quite literally does what it says, connects to an infrastructure provider, right? So in the case of this connection, we could be calling out to the Diagrid infrastructure. We could be calling out to something like SNS SQS running on AWS, which Alice will show later. Could be Azure Service Bus. So you get that kind of layer of abstraction on top of the infrastructure broker, which you can then swap out without any changes to those two application boxes in green. And then ultimately you'll create a subscription. So here we can see we are using the V1 publish API. We're targeting the pub sub connection and whatever that backend infrastructure is in that connection. And then basically we want to publish this to the new orders topic. And then essentially the app ID of the consumer will listen for that, that message to come in and then deliver it to a particular method on the receiving application. For the key value API, it's a little bit more simplistic because there aren't necessarily other services involved, right? It's a one-to-one relationship in this case. So you have your application running, your application calls out to its Catalyst App ID using that API token, and then essentially that Catalyst App ID will facilitate a connection to a backend database, which once again can be the database infrastructure of your choice. I'm not sure how many we have today, probably within the range of maybe 10 plus, 10 to 15. That you can swap out and leverage really across the major cloud providers. And then last but not least, the bindings API. So once again, this really allows a lot of flexibility in terms of the direction, right? It could be an input or output binding, but your application calls out to its app ID. This is going to be, a pretty consistent theme here. And then ultimately uses a connection, which in this case would be Postgres. So your application can go out and, output a particular piece of data to the Postgres connection after, doing some processing on the application side, and you've removed that Postgres connection or any of that Postgres SDK or library directly from your application code. And what's really nice is that on top of all of these kind of connections, you get baked in resiliency, as Alice mentioned, right? So I can create resiliency policies. For example, I could create an outbound resiliency policy on my key value store, which says, hey, I want to, retry 10 times. If those retries fail, I'd like to open a circuit breaker. All of that is kind of provided for you by default out of, within Catalyst and with the Catalyst APIs. Okay, so core concepts, we've covered these in the previous slides, but this kind of just really puts it together in one succinct image. So your application's running externally and using the Catalyst APIs that are powered by Dapper to communicate to an application twin running inside of Catalyst. This application ID will do a couple of things. First and foremost, it's going to establish connections based on the connection resources that you have scoped to it. So for example, PubSub could be the connection for our Diagrid managed PubSub, KV State, the connection to our Diagrid managed key value store. And then I could also have an external connection to Redis running in, Azure, for example. And as long as I've scoped my application ID to have access to these connections, I will be able to use those from my external application called my app. And then in addition, we'll have some other resources that are potentially loaded by an app ID, for example, subscriptions, right? So maybe I have a subscription for the My App ID so that my listening app can receive messages that are sent to a particular topic on a particular connection. And then what that app ID is going to allow your application to do once it's invoked is essentially reach out to those infrastructure resources, getting that level of portability and also flexibility because of the level of abstraction that the connection provides you. So it's really two different buckets, your app and your infrastructure, which you're responsible for, and then ultimately the app IDs and connections, which are hosted by Diagrid Cloud, or within Diagrid Cloud, I should say. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. We have 35 minutes left in this session, and we're going to put the slides away and we're going to just focus on some demo scenarios. And really, this isn't going to be, a complete and total tour through every Catalyst feature, but hopefully it'll at least get you to a place where you feel comfortable getting up and running yourself. And, can feel free to kind of start experimenting with different use cases on the platform. So what we're going to be doing is, if you see these boxes in green on the bottom of the screen, these are going to represent the external application that's running. And in this case, I'm going to be showing you what it looks like to really demo with local code. So I'm going to have two applications that are running both in VS Code. I'm going to kick them off using the CLI, and I'm going to connect directly to the app IDs that we've deployed into Catalyst, or that we will deploy into Catalyst, in order to make use of those Catalyst APIs. So I've got my local code that's going to be producing messages. The producer is going to be hitting its app ID. This represents a Python application, and ultimately the code should actually be in this box. So that's just a mistake on my end in translating this over. But your app ID will represent that Python producer, and essentially it's going to load up a connection to our managed pub sub broker, which it publishes the message to. And then we're going to have our app ID for the consumer. And this app ID is going to subscribe to that connection on a particular topic, and then deliver the messages to that topic to our local code running as the consumer. And then last but not least, the consumer is going to call back out to its app ID using an API token in order to store the result of that message in our key value store. So this is going to be completely using Diagrid infrastructure and local code. There's no deployment required to any cloud provider, any dependency on a particular hosting platform. So right now you're dropped into Diagrid Catalyst. This may be your first time seeing the UI if you didn't have an opportunity to check out and let me see if I can hide this panel. There we go. So this might be the first time you're seeing this if you haven't explored some of our video demos or signed up for your trial yet. But essentially the first thing we're dropped into is a default project within a given organization. So we can see here that I'm in that I have the Catalyst webinar and a demo project, or excuse me, organization that I have access to. So in this case, you'll only have one organization, and within that organization, you can create multiple projects. So right now I'm in the Order App Cloud project, which is what Alice is going to be using for her demo. Dallas will be using for her demo. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project, because essentially within an organization, the project is really the boundary through which you can enforce a series of app IDs and connections that can communicate with one another and connect to that external solution. So a good example of this is kind of, Alice here has an order app. She might deploy all of the microservice app IDs that connect to her order system running externally. So we'll create a new project, and there's a couple of important things to call out when you create a new project. So we'll just go ahead and call this, we'll call it Order App Local. And we can pick a region today, AWS US West, right? We have constrained region availability with just one, but the objective long-term is that this region will be, across cloud providers so that you can have as much locality as possible, and then ultimately connect to this in a secure fashion, right? Without having to go over the public internet. So these are some of the long-term visions that we have. But once you select a region, you can also pick to deploy out of the box these managed services that we've discussed in the slides. So for example, I can get a default pub sub broker, which is completely managed by the Catalyst platform. I can get a default key value store for use with the key value API. And then in addition to these infrastructure services, we also enable essentially setting up managed workflow. So the workflow API is dependent on workflow state, and ultimately any transactional state store or connection that you onboard to Catalyst, think Cosmos DB, for example, can be used as the backend for your workflow API. But ultimately, we wanted to make it easier for you by providing the ability for us to manage workflow state. So this would allow you to basically start using that workflow API immediately out of the box without having to set up any kind of like workflow state store. So we'll go ahead and just create the project with these default services. We're going to be focusing primarily on the pub sub broker and the key value store today. So we'll let that project kind of get up and running, but here we can now see we have two projects. We also provide some egress and ingress addresses. So this can really just help if you're, setting this up and want to communicate an allow list through your firewall or something like that, right? You don't have to just kind of let all public internet traffic come in. You can essentially add these IPs and know that as that project exists, these are going to be static. So now that I'm in now that I have created this new project, we'll switch over, and now we're in that Order App Local project. And what we need to do is we need to create two app IDs, right? So as I mentioned before, we're going to have a producer and a consumer. These are the code samples I'm going to have running locally. So we'll go ahead and we'll create two app IDs. So we'll do one for the producer And what's interesting here is that there's a couple features that you can do, immediately, or some configuration that you can set. So one is you can connect to an existing application. So this is great if you've already deployed your application to a given hosting platform and you want to go ahead and provide the application endpoint on which the producer app ID will talk to your app external from Catalyst, right? So to deliver messages, to deliver invocation requests. In this case, the producer doesn't actually need an application connection because it's only publishing inbound messages. So it's going to be using an API token, but doesn't have any reason to receive any requests from the Catalyst platform. And then on top of that, if you're going to be using the request reply or service invocation API, you can set some default policies out of the box that allow you to ensure when you're talking to other applications that happens in a reliable and resilient way. And, the long-term vision for this will be that you can choose particular app IDs and set particular resiliency policies based on, if that application is idempotent or if there's particular logic that requires, a timeout policy that's maybe larger than the timeout policy we provide by default. So today, for this case, we really just need to provide a name. It's that simple. And then we're going to create one more application ID for our consumer. And I'm not going to connect to an existing application at this time, even though I do need an app connection, because we're going to be running locally. So the Catalyst platform will actually take care of setting up a local app connection for me, through our Dev CLI, which I'll be showcasing here in just a second. So we'll let those app IDs get up and running. And then I also kind of want to give you a quick tour of our connection experience. So I mentioned briefly that you get managed connections and managed services whenever you deploy the project. So we can see here we have two managed services. We have a PubSub provider, which is called PubSub, and then we have a key value store, which is called KV store. So these are those infrastructure services that were provisioned during the project creation experience. And then I get managed connections for these infrastructure services. And the goal for this is really to allow these connections to be managed just like any other external connections you're creating. And I won't walk through the creation experience, as Alice is going to be doing that as we progress through the session. But ultimately, you could onboard additional connections to external resources. The last thing I need to do in order to get this up and running, right? I've got my consumer, I've got my producer, I have my managed connection. What I need to do is I actually need to create a subscription, right? So I want my consumer to be able to listen to messages coming from the producer. So we need to go in and create a PubSub subscription. So I'm just going to call this maybe order sub. I choose a connection I want to target. So this is saying I want to subscribe to messages on a particular broker, in this case, the broker represented by the PubSub connection. And then I basically choose a series of scopes. So this means which applications will actually listen and receive the delivered messages from this particular subscription. So in this case, just the consumer, right? I only want the consumer to listen to the messages on this broker. And then ultimately, I'm going to provide a topic. So we'll say the topic is called orders. I can provide a dead letter topic. So obviously, whenever we're retrying calls, if for whatever reason that message became undeliverable, I can essentially send that to a dead letter queue. And then the default route is going to be, where does this message get sent within the application by default if I don't provide any additional complex routing rules? And so what we're going to say is new orders, because I know that's the method within my application code that's receiving these messages and will be processing them. And then the last thing to call out here is that application IDs that subscribe will only receive messages when they have an application endpoint, right? Which makes sense in this case, right? If your application doesn't exist, we can't deliver messages to it. So that's just something to be aware of. When you create this, your app ID will be subscribed, but ultimately the delivery won't occur because there's no outbound application through which that message can be processed. So we'll create this subscription, and it's as simple as that, right? I've got the PubSub broker out of the box. I've got two app IDs that are ready to go. And then I have a PubSub subscription that's going to allow the delivery of those messages from the producer to the consumer. So without further ado, let's dive into the code. And I want to be conscientious. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly so that we can make sure Alice has plenty of time for her cloud demo. But here, I just want to dive into what does my application code actually look like? It's good and great that you provide these APIs, but ultimately, how useful are they if you're not calling them, from your applications? And the answer would be not that useful. So, it's really a critical piece of the process to wire up your applications to call out to Catalyst. So as we mentioned, this is powered by Dapper open source, which ultimately means that we have compatibility with the existing Dapper open source ecosystem. And within that, we actually enable you to use the existing battle-tested Dapper SDKs to communicate to Catalyst. So although we are managing and maintaining these APIs, you still get a really consistent way of interacting with them, using the existing Dapper SDKs without, us reinventing the wheel. So we'll look at our producer first. It's pretty straightforward here. We have a single endpoint. I'm basically going to post to this endpoint. And what this endpoint is going to do is it's going to publish orders using the Dapper client, which is something that's given to you through the Dapper SDK and instantiated. Now, what's nice is because of Catalyst and because of the way that the SDKs work, we're actually going to configure the Dapper client to talk to Catalyst through a series of environment variables, which we inject automatically when you're doing local development. So I'll show you what that looks like, but I don't have to, tell the Dapper client to talk directly to Catalyst. I just provide some environment variables, which will configure the Dapper client on my behalf, keeping my code really nice and clean. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use that Dapper client to publish an event. And the really critical pieces of information that you'll be configuring within your application code, instead of, wiring up a Redis SDK or wiring up Kafka, is we're going to provide the name of the pub sub connection, which in this case is pub sub. I could override that via an environment variable. We're going to pass in the topic name, which in this case is orders, but once again, that can be, overridden. And then we're going to pass in, some data that we want to package as a cloud event. And we're going to publish that message to the pub sub broker running in Diagrid Catalyst. And then, ultimately the consuming code is just as simple, right? So if we take a look, we have a Python application producing and a C# app consuming. We have an application method on our route that's called new orders, which we saw in that subscription I created. So the message will get delivered to this particular route on the application. And we're going to take that message that we receive and we're going to save it in a state store. So you can see how simple it is to interact with state via Catalyst instead of having, once again, S3 sitting here or Cosmos DB code or resiliency logic, right? I can just save state using the Dapper client, and I get all of those benefits that the Catalyst API provides me. So pretty basic here. And once again, this Dapper client will be initialized using our local development experience, which I'm going to show you now. So we've got our two applications locally. We have our app IDs. I can use the Diagrid CLI to list my app IDs. And this will show that consumer and producer app ID that we set up. So what's nice is I can use some local dev commands. So we'll do Diagrid Dev scaffold. And what this is going to do is create a local manifest that allows me to connect from my local machine up to the Catalyst APIs. So these are those environment variables that I mentioned we're going to inject into the applications as they're running. So we have an API token, which is how we make outbound calls from our application inbound to Catalyst. We have the app ID, and then we have the project URL. So this project URL is actually what the Dapper client will be connecting to and what our APIs will be calling out against. It really represents that point of ingress. And then you'll see some other commands here that are kind of critical. One of them is the app port. So if my application needs to receive inbound communication from Catalyst, I can pass in the app port and it will establish a local connection for me to my dev machine. So in the case of the consumer, we'll put app port of 5001 because that's what port it's going to be running on in my local machine. And then I'm also going to pass in another environment variable that the .NET application needs to run, which is ASP.NET Core URLs. And this basically tells the application which port to run on. So we'll do 5001. And then I'm going to do the same for my Python application, except for I don't need an application port because ultimately I'm only making outbound calls. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to inform, I believe it's unicorn URL. And I think, let me just do a quick confirmation here. Yeah, unicorn port is what we need, which is going to tell the Python app which port to run on. So we'll do 5002 just to make sure we don't have any port conflicts. And then I want to start up the applications. So I'm going to actually run my application, establish the connection from Catalyst. So in this case, it's going to be a .NET run, which should get my app up and running. And then I believe the unicorn, I just want to make sure this is the startup for my Python app. Now, once again, depending on the language that you're using, all of this will be something that you can ultimately configure yourself. And you can run this in a multitude of ways. We have a good doc that kind of talks about it, but essentially you can be running this without the application, just establishing an inbound connection from Catalyst. And you could be using something like a debugger instead of, running this directly side by side. But we're going to do this for the sake of brevity and for the sake of the demo. So we should be up and running. I've already installed my dependencies in both of these applications. So we should be able to, fingers crossed, a live demo is always a fun time. What we should be able to do is a Diagrid Dev start. So what this is going to do, it's going to create the local connection to my consumer on 5001. It's going to fire up my applications, injecting all of the required environment variables, and then we should be able to use the APIs from there. So it's going to use that. Sorry, we'll remove this. Yeah, me and that app should be good.
You got one more comma in there, Kendall. Yeah, there you go.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll try this one more time. It's going to use that local file in order to get both of these apps up and running. So what we can see that it's doing here is it says it's connecting to the consumer. And we can see that we've connected the app ID consumer to our local host 5001, which is great, right? Our objective is really to connect that app ID to the local machine. And then we can see that our producer is also up and running on the port that we expected, 5002. So in order to show this in action, I'm just going to basically post a message, which should be fairly simple here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up that portal. And one thing I want to show you here just really briefly is that I can actually generate a curl request directly to this service. So I can go into my producer and I can actually see what it would look like to hit that PubSub API directly. And it'll give me a curl command, which is really cool. So we'll test that this is working as expected. We pass in the orders topic, and here we can see what that request really looks like. So this is what our Dapper SDK will be making on the back end, right? It's going to be calling out to our project the V1 publish API, the PubSub connection on the orders topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this, but we're going to point it at our local. Let's do a test hash here. What we're going to do is actually point this at our locally running instance, right? Because the application is going to be doing this call. So what I want to do is just post a message to the producer. So this is going to become HTTP localhost 5002. And then I'm basically going to be passing in that data payload of order ID of 20. So this is all we're going to do. And we're going to see this in action. Okay. Application should be up and running here. We got a 404 not found. Does anybody know why? I know why. It's because I left off the method name. So we're going to put that in there. It's going to be orders, I believe. So we're going to make a post to the orders endpoint. Yep. There we go. All right. Awesome. So what we should see, we got a 200 OK. And on top of that, we're also going to see some really good output. So we can see that our publish was successful to the managed PubSub broker. And then we can see that we got a, let's see, the state store is not found. So this should be key value store. So that's something that I missed here. When we look at the consumer app, we can see that the state store name was set to state store. So what I want to do is actually pass in the environment variable to call it key value store, because that's the name of the connection we created. So this is actually a good exercise here to kind of see, we can pass this in and change out the connection we're using, and we get a really clear error message, right? So we're going to rerun this with the correct environment variable pointing to that key value store, and we're going to make that same request. All right, awesome. So it looks like it didn't pick up that environment variable because I put it on the wrong app. I'm so sorry, team. Thanks for your patience. This should go here under the consumer. And then we should get it. We love a good local debug. It's always good. Alice, I'll wrap it up after this, and then I'll give it over to you just because I know we're low on time. Okay, so we can see that the order was successfully persisted, which was ultimately our goal, right? And that was what's really cool about this is that we received this through that local app connection. So if we go back over to the portal kind of before I hand it over to Alice to show the code running in the cloud, we can see that our consumer has this local app connection, right? It's hitting our local endpoint and using a particular app token to talk to our application that we could also validate, right? We can validate this app token is expected to make sure that the caller is secure. So that's really how you can do, a quick and easy way of using these APIs, using this, this really great, very flexible configuration file in order to create local connections and also talk directly to Catalyst without having to really do much in the application code other than make, a couple simple calls. So Alice, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks for your patience. Sorry for those couple of hiccups.
Okay, so after Kendall just showed, some of the local capabilities that you can take advantage of with Catalyst, I'm going to take those exactly the same apps and see what they look like in the cloud. And we have 10 minutes, so but that's okay. We can do this. So essentially, I have two applications here, right? They're the same applications. I have a Python producer and a consumer that's written in .NET. And essentially what this is this Python producer is actually running within AWS App Runner, and it is calling out to the Catalyst APIs. Again, it's exactly the same code as Kendall showed, so it is using the Dapper SDKs to do this. And then we are using a connection within Catalyst, and this we are calling out to external infrastructure. In this case, it's AWS SNS SQS using a topic and a subscriber in there. And then on the other side, we are using Azure Container Apps. And what we're doing is we have a .NET application that's running in Azure Container Apps and its associated application ID that we have created within Catalyst. And this is the consumer application. And this is going to consume messages from that producer, and it is going to save state in Azure Storage. And again, this is using an Azure Storage connection from Catalyst that calls out to my Azure Storage blob storage from the application using the Dapper SDK as well. So again, same application, just running in the cloud in this case. And it's important to call out here, Catalyst does fit other scenarios that do not necessarily span multiple clouds or platforms, just because it does provide a single API service, which can be used kind of to standardize across all these platforms. It makes it a really nice capability for this. So I'm going to pop into the Catalyst portal. You can kind of see here, this looks fairly similar to what Kendall was showing. We have our two application IDs. I have a producer and a consumer that I've already pre-created. I also have a PubSub subscription. And this PubSub subscription is using a connection within AWS PubSub. It is routing to new orders, which is on my consumer application, and it is using the topic orders. And I should say it's scoped to the consumer app. So again, it's ensuring that the consumer application identity that's living within Catalyst is going to be getting all of those messages. Okay, so I'm going to create I guess I'll show you quickly what those applications look like running in the cloud. So you can see here, I have this producer application. It is running an app runner. I already deployed this because it takes a couple minutes to deploy, but essentially it's a fairly standard app. Again, it's the same code that Kendall showed before. It's the Python code, and it has a couple of environment variables that have already been set for it. So if I go down to here, you can see some of the environment variables. I have the Dapper API token, gRPC endpoint, and HTTP endpoint, as well as the PubSub name environment variables set already on this app. And what this is going to do, right, is it's going to provide the connectivity to Diagrid Cloud and enable my application to send a message from App Runner to Diagrid Cloud using these credentials. And it's important to mention that we do use the API token authentication. So every API call into Catalyst requires this API token. Otherwise, it will not be authenticated. The other thing I want to call out is this PubSub name. So we have, instead of taking advantage of the Diagrid created PubSub and state stores, we are using an AWS PubSub broker. And again, all I'm doing here is providing that name as an environment variable for AWS PubSub. On the subscribing or the consuming side, we have a consumer application that's running within Azure, and this is using an Azure Container Apps. And you can see here that this is called consumer. I have, a similar setup where I deployed that .NET's consumer here. And you can also see within the environment variables that I have set, I have similar environment variables set. This application calls back, it receives the messages from, my producer application through that PubSub connection through AWS SQS, and then it's going to actually save state as well. So it needs to call out back to Catalyst in order to save state using the state API. You can also see here I have the state store name, which is AZ state, again, set as an environment variable. So from there, I'm going to jump into these connections. You can see I have already pre-created this AWS PubSub connection. This is, talking to or connecting to my PubSub that's running in AWS. It's using the access key and secret key that I pre-created already. And, I've set these scopes to be able to talk to both the producer and the consumer applications. I'm going to create a new connection for you, and this is going to be that Azure State Store, the Azure Blob Storage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through our UI for the connection creation experience. We support, a ton of different component or connections here, very akin to, the Dapper open source components as well that have been, used across many enterprises in production. And you can see that I have for state, there's a number of different options. Today, again, I'm going to be using Azure Blob Storage. And I just want to call out to all the Dapper users as well that we do support, importing the open source Dapper YAML manifests in directly to here as well. So if you are coming from the Dapper platform or the Dapper open source project, and you want to, continually use Catalyst, but on, maybe a platform that doesn't support Dapper natively, like essentially not Kubernetes, this Catalyst is a really great option for you. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to choose the access control. So essentially I can choose the access control for what application identity or what application twin is going to be able to access this connection. In this case, I want only the to be able to access this connection. And then from there, I get to choose the authentication profile. So we support, a number of different authentication profiles out of the box. Specifically on Azure, we support Azure Active Directory as well. But, today I'm going to be using this account key profile just to make things really quick. Jumping back over to the Azure portal here, this is the storage account that I'm going to be using. I'm going to come in and I'm actually just going to grab my access key directly from the portal just to show you how this is all working. This is the storage account name. I'm going to paste this guy in here, and then I'm going to copy the key, and I will change this key afterwards because I know this is going to be live on YouTube. Oh, didn't copy it. Come in. There you go. And then there you go, boom. Now we have a number of different metadata properties that I can use to configure this connection. And it's important to call out here that these connection properties are going to be different. They're going to be different for every single connection that you're creating. The other thing that I just wanted to do is I need to make sure that this connection is called AZ state. Because if you remember from within my container app, it's using that environment variable that's set to be AZ-state. And then this is just whatever I really want it to be. This will create a storage container within Azure Blob Storage. I'm going to use the orders container today, but this is, up to you. And then I can also optionally enable resiliency policies on this call as well. I'm not going to do that now just in terms of time, but then essentially I'm going to create this connection, and you can see what it's going to be doing here is it's going to call out to those connection infrastructure details to call out to those and make sure that we can actually connect from this platform. So it's going to go from processing, hopefully to provisioning, and then eventually ready here in a second. And then I'm going to test these applications out kind of end to end. So go into App IDs. First, I'm going to use the API Explorer. This is something that Kendall demoed already, but essentially, once this thing goes live, come on. What we can do within the API Explorer is actually test any of these APIs that we offer on Catalyst, live within the user interface here. So I'm going to test out the publish API. I'm going to test it out, on the producer application identity. I'm going to use the AWS pub sub on the orders topic, and let's switch out this orders name, this order number here, just to be more specific. Let's see. Okay, cool, ready, awesome. I gotta change this one again. So I'm going to send this guy, and what this is going to do is it's going to make a request again on that publish and subscribe API, and it's not going to go through my producer. It's actually going to hit only its application identity that's running within Catalyst. So you can see here that we got a status 204, no content. That's great. That means that's a successful status as far as this goes. And then on the subscribing side, I'm actually going to jump into that container app. Again, this is on the consumer subscribing side, and I'm going to check out the log stream, which is just going to show me some live logs. And, you can see, I have 1 minute left, and you can see that order 9999 was actually successfully persisted. So this is great, kind of just showing that end-to-end capability. I can also do one quick curl command, which essentially, I'll do that, will do the end-to-end. Let's use, 9998. And I'm going to send this guy end to end. And this is going to go all the way through, from my producer, which is running on AWS App Runner. So I can see, I'm going to go here, logs, application logs, 9998. And then, this is actually going to be 9998 coming through my container app, and then actually using that new connection that I created within Catalyst and actually saving that within my orders state store here. So you can see those two orders that I actually just created. So 9999 and 9998 got created and saved successfully, just again by using the Catalyst APIs. So that was, kind of a whirlwind demo of the cloud scenario, but I just wanted to jump over and show everyone some Catalyst resources before, we have to drop. I would, everyone on this call, it would be really great if you could join the early access program. We are offering, Catalyst as a free service today entirely. And we have this QR code where you can sign up. We have a number of other demos and, quick starts that you can take advantage of. We also have this entire code that we are hosting today, or that we use today on the Diagrid Labs Catalyst webinar GitHub repository. And then, we also have a number of other resources that you can take advantage of.